Industrial warfare is a period in the history of warfare ranging roughly from the early 19th century and the start of the Industrial Revolution to the beginning of the Atomic Age, which saw the rise of nation-states capable of creating and equipping large armies, navies, and air forces. Through the process of industrialization, the era featured mass-conscripted armies, rapid transportation, telegraph and wireless communications, and the concept of total war. In terms of technology, this era saw the rise of rifled, breech-loading infantry weapons capable of high rates of fire, high-velocity breech-loading artillery, chemical weapons, armored warfare, metal warships, submarines, and aircraft. Total war. One of the main features of industrial warfare is the concept of total war. The term was coined during World War I by Erich Ludendorff, which called for the complete mobilization and subordination of all resources, including policy and social systems, to the German war effort. It has also come to mean waging warfare with absolute ruthlessness, and its most identifiable legacy today has been the reintroduction of civilians and civilian infrastructure as targets in destroying the enemy's ability to engage in war. There are several reasons for the rise of total warfare in the 19th century. The main one is industrialization. As countries' capital and natural resources grew, it became clear that some forms of warfare demanded more resources than others. Consequently, the greater cost of warfare became evident. An industrialized nation could distinguish and then choose the intensity of warfare that it wished to engage in. Additionally, warfare was becoming more mechanized and required greater infrastructure. Combatants could no longer live off the land, but required an extensive support network of people behind the lines to keep them fed and armed. This required the mobilization of the home front. Modern concepts like propaganda were first used to boost production and maintain morale, while rationing took place to provide more war materiel. The earliest modern example of total war was the American Civil War. Union generals Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman were convinced that, if the North was to be victorious, the Confederacy's strategic, economic, and psychological ability to wage war had to be definitively crushed. They believed that to break the backbone of the South, the North had to employ scorched earth tactics, or as Sherman called it, hard war. Sherman's advance through Georgia and the Carolinas was characterized by widespread destruction of civilian supplies and infrastructure. In contrast to later conflicts, the damage done by Sherman was almost entirely limited to property destruction. In Georgia alone, Sherman claimed he and his men had caused $100 million in damages. Conscription. Conscription is the compulsory enrollment of civilians into military service. Conscription allowed the French Republic to form La Grande Armée Écoutée, what Napoleon Bonaparte called the nation in arms, which successfully battled European professional armies. Conscription, particularly when the conscripts are being sent to foreign wars that do not directly affect the security of the nation, has historically been highly politically contentious in democracies. For instance, during World War I, bitter political disputes broke out in Canada, Newfoundland, Australia and New Zealand over conscription. Canada also had a political dispute over conscription during World War II. Both South Africa and Australia put limits on where conscripts could fight in World War II. Similarly, mass protests against conscription to fight the Vietnam War occurred in several countries in the late 1960s. In developed nations, the increasing emphasis on technological firepower and better trained fighting forces, the sheer unlikelihood of a conventional military assault on most developed nations, as well as memories of the contentiousness of the Vietnam War experience, make mass conscription unlikely in the foreseeable future. Russia, as well as many smaller nations such as Switzerland, retain mainly conscript armies. Transportation. Land. Prior to the invention of the motorized transport, combatants were transported by wagons, horses and by marching. With the advent of locomotives, large groups of combatants, supplies, and equipment were able to be transported faster and in larger numbers. To counter this, an opposing force would destroy rail lines to hinder their enemy's movements. General Sherman's men during the American Civil War would destroy tracks, heated the rails, and wrap them around trees. The mass transportation of combatants was further revolutionized with the advent of the internal combustion engine and the automobile. Combined with the widespread use of the machine guns, the horse, after millennia of use, was finally supplanted in its wartime role. During both World War I and World War II, trucks were used to carry combatants and materiel, while cars and jeeps were used to scout enemy positions. The mechanization of infantry occurred during World War II. The tank, a product of World War I invented by the British to break through trenches while withstanding machine gun fire, while discounted by many, came into its own. Tanks evolved from thin-skinned, lumbering vehicles into fast, powerful war machines of various types that dominated the battlefield and allowed the Germans to conquer most of Europe. As a result of the tank's evolution, a number of armored transport vehicles appeared, such as armored personnel carriers and amphibious vehicles. After the war ended, armored transports continued to evolve. The armored car and train declined in use, largely becoming relegated to military and civilian use as transportation for VIPs. Infantry fighting vehicles rose to prominence with the creation of the Soviet BMP-1. IFVs are a more combat-capable version of the APC, with heavier armaments, while still retaining the ability to transport combatants into and out of battles. CC lift is a military logistics term referring to the use of cargo ships for the deployment of military assets, such as weaponry, military personnel, and materiel supplies. It complements other means of transport, such as strategic airlifters, in order to enhance a state's ability to project power. A state's sea lift capabilities may include civilian-operated ships that normally operate by contract, but which can be chartered or commandeered during times of military necessity to supplement government-owned naval fleets. During World War I, the United States bought, borrowed or commandeered vessels of various types, ranging from pleasure craft to ocean liners to transport the American Expeditionary Force to Europe. Many of these ships were scrapped, sold or returned to their owners after the war. There are two different kinds of airlifts in warfare: a strategic airlift and a tactical airlift. A strategic airlift is the use transporting of weapons, supplies and personnel over long distances using large cargo aircraft. This contrasts with tactical airlifts, which involves transporting the same above items within a theater of operations. This usually involves cargo planes with shorter ranges and slower speeds, but higher maneuverability. Communications. Cryptography. Homing pigeon, war pigeon. Joint Army, Navy phonetic alphabet. Message precedence. Semaphore. Signal corps. Smoke signal. Telegraphy. Equipment or Aldous lamp. International maritime signal flags. Land warfare. Land warfare, as the name implies, takes place on land. The most common type of warfare, it can encompass several modes and locales, including urban, Arctic and mountain warfare. The early part of the 19th century from 1815 to 1848 saw a long period of peace in Europe, accompanied by extraordinary industrial expansion. The Industrial Age brought about various technological advancements, each with their own implication. Land warfare moved from visual range and semi-person to person combat of the previous era, to indiscriminate and impersonal, beyond visual range warfare. The Crimean War saw the introduction of trench warfare, long-range artillery, railroads, the telegraph and the rifle. The mechanized mass destruction of enemy combatants grew ever more deadly. In World War I, machine guns, barbed wire, chemical weapons and landmines entered the battlefield. The deadly stalemated trench warfare stage was finally passed with the advent of the modern armored tank late in World War I. One major trend involved the transition away massed infantry fire and human waves to more refined tactics. This became possible with the superseding of earlier weapons like the highly inaccurate musket. Technological advances. Rifling refers to the act of adding spiral grooves to the inside the barrel of a firearm. The grooves would cause a projectile to spin as it traveled down the barrel, improving range and accuracy. Once rifling became easier and practical, a new type of firearm was introduced, the rifle. It gave combatants the ability to specifically target an enemy combatant, rather than have large numbers of combatants fire in a general direction. It effectively broke up groups of combatants into smaller, more maneuverable units. Artillery are large guns designed to fire large projectiles a great distance. Early artillery pieces were large and cumbersome with slow rates of fire. This reduced their use to sieges, by both defenders and attackers. With the advent of the industrial age and various technological advancements, lighter, yet powerful and accurate artillery pieces were produced. This gave rise to field artillery, which were used on a tactical level to support troops. Machine guns are fully automatic guns. In this era of warfare they only existed as mounted support weapons, as automatic firearms were not yet developed. Early machine guns, as invented by Gatling, were hand-cranked but evolved into truly automatic machine guns by Maxim at the end of their era. Machine guns were valued for their ability to smash infantry formations, especially attacking enemy formations when they were dense. This, along with effective field artillery, changed tactics drastically. Static defenses evolved from the use of permanent fortifications that were direct descendants of medieval castles. As artillery improved in destructive power and penetrative ability, more modern fortifications were developed, using first thicker layers of stone, then concrete and steel. After naval artillery developed the turret, a moving cannon platform, land fortifications started to use this method as well. Between the world wars, France built an impregnable, underground steel and concrete fortification that ran the length of the German-French border. This Maginot Line failed to stop German tanks in 1940. They bypassed the fortifications by invading through neighboring Belgium. Temporary fortifications. As artillery and rifles allowed the killing of enemy personnel at a longer effective range, soldiers started to dig into temporary fortifications. These included massive trenches as used in World War I, and individual soldier-sized foxholes, which became more common in World War II. Maneuver warfare. Maneuver had existed throughout military history, from soldiers marching on the field to using horses in cavalry formations. It was not until the advent of mechanized transport over unprepared terrain, such as fields and deserts, using tanks and armored vehicles, that maneuver warfare became feasible. First used by the German army in Poland and France in World War II. Blitzkrieg or lightning war saw whole armies move rapidly on tracked and armored fighting vehicles. During the war, airborne movement was used, with soldiers dropped to the battlefield by parachute by both the Germans and the Allies. After World War II, developments in helicopters brought a more practical way to transport troops by air. Armored warfare. Blitzkrieg. Deep operations. Naval warfare. Ironclads and dreadnoughts. The period after the Napoleonic Wars was one of intensive experimentation with new technology. Steam power for ships appeared in the 1810. Improved metallurgy and machining technique produced larger and deadlier guns, and the development of explosive shells, capable of demolishing a wooden ship at a single blow, in turn required the addition of iron armor, which led to ironclads. The famous Battle of the CSS Virginia and US Monitor in the American Civil War was the jewel of ironclads that symbolized the changing times. Although the battle was inconclusive, nations around the world subsequently raced to convert their fleets to iron, as ironclads had shown themselves to be clearly superior to wooden ships in their ability to withstand enemy fire. In the late 19th century, naval warfare was revolutionized by Alfred Thayer Mahan's book The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Mahan argued that in the Anglo-French wars of the 18th and 19th centuries, domination of the sea was the deciding factor in the outcome, and therefore control of seaborne commerce was critical to military victory. Mahan argued that the best way to achieve naval domination was through large fleets of concentrated capital ships, as opposed to commerce raiders. His books were closely studied in all the great powers, influencing their naval arms race in the years prior to World War I. As the century came to a close, the familiar modern battleship began to emerge, a steel-armored ship, entirely dependent on steam, and sporting a number of large shell guns mounted in turrets arranged along the center line of the main deck. The ultimate design was reached in 1906 with HMS Dreadnought, which entirely dispensed with smaller guns, her main guns being sufficient to sink any existing ship of the time. The Russo-Japanese War, and particularly the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, was the first test of the new concepts, resulting in a stunning Japanese victory and the destruction of dozens of Russian ships. World War I pitted the old Royal Navy against the new Navy of Imperial Germany, culminating in the 1916 Battle of Jutland. Following the war, many nations agreed to limit the size of their fleets in the Washington Naval Treaty and scrapped many of their battleships and cruisers. Growing tensions of the 1930s restarted the building programs, with even larger ships than before. The Japanese battleship Yamato, launched in 1941, displaced 72,000 tons and mounted 18-inch guns. This marked the climax of big gun warfare, as aircraft would gradually play a larger role in warfare. By the 1960s, battleships had all but vanished from the fleets of the world. Aircraft carriers. Between the world wars, the first aircraft carriers appeared, initially as a way to circumvent the tonnage limits of the Washington Naval Treaty. Though several ships had previously been designed to launch, and in some cases, the first true, flat-top carrier was HMS Argus, launched in December 1917. By the start of World War II, aircraft carriers typically carried three types of aircraft. Torpedo bombers, which could also be used for conventional horizontal bombing and reconnaissance, dive bombers, also used for reconnaissance, and fighters for fleet defense and bomber escort duties. Because of the restricted space on aircraft carriers, these aircraft were almost always small, single-engined warplanes. The first true demonstration of naval air power was the victory of the Royal Navy at the Battle of Taranto in 1940, which set the stage for Japan's much larger and more famous attack on Pearl Harbor the following year. 2 days after Pearl Harbor, the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse marked the beginning of the end for the battleship era. Following World War II, aircraft carriers continued to remain key to navies throughout the latter 20th century, moving in the 1950s to jets launched from supercarriers, behemoths which could displace as much as 100,000 tons. Submarines. Just as important was the development of submarines to travel underneath the sea, at first for short dives, then later to be able to spend weeks or months underwater powered by a nuclear reactor. The first successful submarine attack in wartime was in 1864 by the Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley, which sank the frigate Housatonic. In both world wars, submarines primarily exerted their power by sinking merchant ships using torpedoes, in addition to attacks on warships. All nations practiced unrestricted submarine warfare in which submarines sank merchant ships without warning. But the only successful campaign during this period was America's submarine war against Japan during the Pacific War. In the 1950s, the Cold War inspired the development of ballistic missile submarines. each one loaded with dozens of nuclear-armed missiles and with orders to launch them from sea should the other nation attack.